Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar series hosted by Criterion Human Capital Management, where today we're going to be discussing focus on higher education and the work of, the future of hybrid work in higher ed. I'm really excited about this conversation because I think it's applicable not only to all of those in the higher education sector that are joining us for the call today, but also anybody else that might be interested in hybrid work. I think a lot of the discussions we've had around this topic, up until this point, have been really, really interesting. And I think the future of hybrid work is something that could affect, nearly every industry as we continue about our lives. So another reason I'm really excited is I get the opportunity to interview Amanda Bailey. Hopefully you can see our profiles displayed here on the screen, but this is someone who not only has an immense amount of experience in HR, but also in discussing hybrid work and how we can, make our workplaces more conducive for HR professionals and really, everyone as we move into the future. So Amanda has, as mentioned, over 25 years of experience. She currently resides at Boston University, where she's the Vice President for Human Resources. And I also want to point out that she's the co-chair on the Boston University Task Force for Workplace Culture. So very applicable for our conversation today. Excited to have you. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Colby, and thank you for having me here. It's going to be great this morning. I look forward to a rich discussion.
Thank you so much. And my name is Colby Haverkamp. I'm an enterprise sales executive at Criterion. My background is in technology sales, kind of more generally, but I also spent a ton of time in the public policy realm. I did a short stint for the federal government. So I have a lot of work in kind of organizational management writ large. And so these conversations are really interesting to me and how they affect people both professionally and personally. So with that in mind, if you have questions throughout the conversation, please feel free to drop them in the chat. There is a Q&A portion, and there's also, I think, the ability to chat with us directly if you'd like to send something more private, maybe not in the forum for everybody to see. We're happy to receive those. And I think at that point, are you ready to get started, Amanda?
I am ready, Colby. Let's
Okay,
do it.
cool. Well, I always like to start things off a little more personally, if at all possible. So I did give this to Amanda a little beforehand, so I wasn't blindsiding her with something she didn't have the time to think about. But I always like to ask a question when opening up conversations, and it's what is the top item on your bucket list that you have not yet done that you would like to achieve?
Yeah, Colby, thank you. And thank you so much for that lead time. I think with COVID upon us and now behind us, or hopefully getting more and more behind us, I should say, it's been quite a challenge to think about anything personal. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
appreciate
yeah.
the lead time. And with that in mind, I think, one of the things I'm looking forward to this summer is doing something that I promised my daughter 2 years ago that we would do, which is go to a place where the beautiful stargazing happens, either in camps or in tenant camps or in resort areas. So we're going to be going to Sedona for the first time ever
Okay.
and looking forward to the stargazing shows and the tours that we're going to do for a couple of days. It won't be for very long, but it'll be just long enough that I'll be able to now check it off my bucket list. So I'm looking forward to that.
That's amazing. I love that. What a cool experience for you both. And I have not been to Sedona, but I've heard nothing but wonderful things. So I look forward to kind of hearing the report back from that. So,
Awesome. Well, I'll be back to share it as much as you'd like to learn. All right.
sounds good. Sounds good.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, we'll kind of dive into the conversation here. And I think, really what has sparked this conversation and even really allowed us the space to have the work for, the opportunity for hybrid work in higher ed or elsewhere is, COVID-19. So I think that's probably a good place to start. And really, I'd like to ask, like, what did this moment mean for higher education and ultimately, for the possibility for hybrid work in higher ed institutions?
Yeah, Colby, thank you for that. I mean, I think in particular for higher education, as I work with colleagues so much more closely than I ever have at my level, across multiple levels of institutions, community colleges, four-year colleges that are state public, or private. We've all had some clear trends and patterns that are affecting all of us. And I think one of those irreversible things is a work policy around flexible work, remote or hybrid work. And so I share these in very distinct categories because I think what we've come from, as we'll talk about more today in more detail, is a full remote work schedule for so many of our employees for their health and safety. And now as we moved and evolved to hybrid and to even more evolution on flexible work, I think the biggest irreversible trend has been that all of us need to have some form of one of those in place.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think just to dig in a little bit more on that, we've talked a little bit previously about kind of the intentionality behind making hybrid work for everybody. Obviously, it can be difficult to accommodate every single person's desired work schedule or work environment, but at this point where we kind of enter a world where this is no longer required, perhaps, but a decision that universities and especially higher ed institutions can make. Can you talk to me a little bit about what that impact means, and really just the focus on the intentionality of this sort of work?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, Colby, for many of us, as I mentioned, these irreversible trends in terms of policymaking and policy discussions, what's also come about is what you just mentioned and touched on, which is that intentionality. Management by intention is what I've heard a colleague say that a few months ago. It's not management by location anymore. It used to be management by objective and walking around.
I
It's
love
no
that.
longer management by location, it's management by intention. And that's even why I mentioned those three distinct buckets, right, of remote, hybrid, and now flexible work, right? We continue to iterate, pivot, and evolve to meet our workforce needs. And so with that, I think it's almost a lesson learned that was, kind of unknown, that with that intentionality, what we've done is all organizations, this is even beyond higher ed from what I've seen and learned and
Right.
talked to colleagues about, but we, for health and safety reasons, said to everyone, as long as you can work remotely, go do it. So even as I learned from our employees here at BU and our managers, even for managers who had to work on site, for example, our children's center staff, which rolls up into my office, who had to be here for different reasons, our occupational health staff, our medical
Sure.
center staff, they were working from a distance because of the social distance, measures that had to be in place at that time.
Hmm.
And I feel that, and I hear often the anecdotal feedback that from colleagues everywhere, that now that the safety and health protocols have morphed and evolved, and we're moving more and more into the endemic, there is this real anxiety that flexible work options and flexibility around work, which includes remote and hybrid work, will just vanish and go away. And I
Yeah.
think that's probably the biggest piece about being intentional is making sure that we are all finding ways to offer productivity that can now be still done in a new way of working because we learned these creative things out of necessity, right?
Right.
And so now the necessity is clearing its path out. I think the next big challenge for us as HR colleagues and leaders is to make sure that we're offering policies and a framework as best as we can within our communities that still provide for that creativity to happen and the productivity to happen.
Awesome. I love that. And I think,
Yeah.
obviously, the feedback that you're receiving from your colleagues and the employees at the university, those are legitimate concerns. And really the only way that this can be successful, right, is establishing kind of that feedback loop. Um, that being said, just to follow up a little bit, I know, based on what we mentioned at the top of the call, in your position at Boston University, that this has been a focus by that specific organization. Can you talk to me a little bit about, you know, what the undertaking has looked like at BU, and perhaps, how those discussions materialized and where they are today, if possible?
Yeah, thank you, Colby. Would love to do that. I'm so excited in my role here as HR VP at Boston University. It's been an exciting journey since I've joined in August of last year because my first week, I was able to be involved and asked to engage in discussions to publish for the first time in the university's history remote work guidelines that allowed all staff, based on a year-long study of a cross-functional committee here at BU before I arrived. The guidelines were published, and I just added a little bit of tweaking for a few days that I was here. But it was really unprecedented to allow all staff who were eligible to work 3 days in the office and up to 2 days remotely. And it was an unprecedented step for the community, but what I know will resonate with many HR colleagues like myself is being able to listen to the feedback of the staff and the supervisors of staff, who all felt that the 2-day option and up to 2 days would be the best approach to offer that flexibility. And since then, we've had a myriad of different conversations in different ways about how is our remote work guidelines and policy evolving. And
Sure.
we created the task force, as you mentioned. Thank you for mentioning that. I love that work. Being part of co-chairing with our senior diversity officer, the task force on workplace culture, being able to tie hybrid remote work evolution, if you will, for our staff to cultural norms and cultural trends has been amazing. And we've had a subcommittee, for example, outlining 3 priorities around our culture. One of them is dedicated to flexible work. And this
Okay.
week, I'm happy to share with everyone, we're launching a pilot of a survey on flexible work. It's broader than remote work, as I mentioned earlier. We've learned
Okay.
these 3 distinct categories. And
Yeah.
so our survey on flexible work is going to be launched to our staff next week, where we hope to gauge even better feedback from our staff on how is remote work working. But more importantly, as we've heard a lot about equity for staff who are not eligible for remote work, we want to know what other flexible work options exist that we just don't know about. And so it's a wonderful position to be in, to contribute our expertise, be able to rely on feedback from our staff and our leaders in the subcommittee, who some are individual contributors, and we consider them leaders as well. It's just a wonderful place to be right now. So I'm excited to share the results when we get them.
Excited. I'm so excited to hear more about that, and that's so intriguing. I have been so impressed by the creativity groups like yourself and many others who have found models that work really well for their specific organization. And obviously that kind of varies across the spectrum, but it's been fascinating kind of the things people have come up with to
Yeah.
make not only the most efficient use of their time, but to make time work better for them personally and in their lives outside of work as well.
So true. That is so true. It's amazing how innovative small day-to-day examples of using flexible work to create engagement and find ways of remaining productive and engaged. I've been amazed at what I've learned anecdotally. And so being able to put that in a data format through survey and survey results is even going to be, I think, more powerful because we'll be able to unleash and share publicly across our community what some of those examples have been that some of our department leaders are using and that came straight from our staff. And this is where I think many organizations across higher education have a tremendous opportunity, is offering what works for you across your
Mm-hmm.
community and your community members, given that so many of our higher education institutions are complex and unique to serve the needs of our students locally, regionally, and across the country and globally for some of us, like BU.
Yeah.
It gives us that opportunity to do that we didn't have before. So I look forward to like seeing more of it and continuing to remain agile around it. And I think that's a key tenet. We have to remain open, that nothing is going to stay static for a while.
Amazing. I love this. I'm excited to see the results of that. I hope that you'll share those publicly, and we'll make sure that everybody kind of receives those on this end. Um,
Absolutely.
that being said, I think this is a great segue for probably the top question I had when we began, discussing this topic around hybrid work, and it really was what is the impact of these kind of policies on your talent acquisition and retention at the university? Because my mind was just immediately this has to open up a whole new pool of candidates or possibility
Yeah.
for the university.
That's a great question, Colby. You're absolutely right. I love talking about this question because I feel like we can problem solve at such a greater scale. And, for us here at BU, talent acquisition and retention are two of our key strategic priorities right now. And with that, we have absolutely found that attracting talent across different spaces, it used to be sometimes that we had to be very flexible for specialized skill positions.
Mhm.
I think about auditing jobs, I think about procurement jobs, I think about HR jobs in some spaces like HRIS. And that used to be the notion, and that is no longer the case. We have 80 to 90% of candidates that we're attracting, and we have over 40,000 applications that come in regularly, over 3 to 4 months on an ongoing basis. So when we're attracting applicants today, almost every single one of them are asking, what is your remote work policy and how
Sure.
flexible are you? And that is even beyond, frankly, whether the position requires eligibility for remote work. They just want to learn it. They want to see, if I may, they want to see, are we really walking the talk about flexibility? Because if their
Right.
job doesn't lend itself to remote work, how committed are we to even offering flexible work if it's not remote work? And I think that's where those questions are, that's what those questions are motivated to answer from an attracting talent perspective. And retaining talent is just as critical, as we all know, as we all are facing. And on the point of remote work in particular, I think our talent who are here, employees who are here and want to grow and
Mhm.
see a career path, part of that development now includes how much value are we placing on their work-life integration. I don't even call it work-life balance anymore. I call it work-life integration
Yeah, I love
because,
that.
right? We all check our mobiles. We're all, I'm going to be in Sedona checking my mobile phone every now and then for anything that I need to be on standby for example. But in
Yes.
that work-life integration mode that's been in place for some time as we stay well connected through social media, through work, through devices, we know that our talent, our talented employees here who want to grow into new jobs, they want to know how are we balancing that for them? How much of that integration is going to allow them dedicated time to disconnect and be able to learn the job that they're in and lead others and work with other peers across the community to grow? And if we can't answer that, someone else will. And I think that's the pressure that we've certainly recognized. And we've been stepping up and trying to meet those needs very quickly and remaining agile around it. So, more to come on that and share with you all on that. But I'm really looking forward to learning from all of our colleagues in this space for sure.
I love that. And I'm writing down work-life integration. I'll use that moving forward as well. But I think I already know the answer to this, but I did just want to kind of ask a follow-up. Um, how is Boston University conveying the positions right now? Are they listing them as, ability to hybrid work, or is it truly kind of conversational based on the job
Yeah.
once people are already interested in it? I think from my perspective, it would be nice to have that transparency, but I wondered how groups were approaching that at this point.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I literally had this conversation with our comp team and our comp team leaders yesterday.
Okay.
And we really waited. Frankly, I'm glad that we did. We waited, as I mentioned, we published our remote work guidelines last year. And
Mhm.
because we were so uncertain as to what the evolution of that would look like, the first thing we're going back to is to look at what jobs we want to be a little bit more precise, because we're so large with 17 schools and colleges and our medical center.
Yeah.
We don't want to be so prescriptive where we lock out the opportunity for remote work for some of our staff. In and frankly, based on our assumption through compensation and the structure of compensation, we don't want to make that assumption lock anyone out. So what we've done is waited and assessed how many applications and for what positions have come
Sure.
in to seek up to 2 days of remote work and 3 days in the office. And what we thought is that's a much better precise number to learn what positions, because now we clearly can see from our supervisors that there's
Mhm.
flexibility to do that. And with nearly 45%, I think it's just gone up to 46% over the past month of our staff who are eligible for remote work, we think we have really good traction and stability now to identify which positions. While I don't think we're going to go through and publicly put them on our job postings, we may get to that point. We are absolutely working with our hiring managers to offer that to attract talent to BU. And also, when employees get promoted, we want them to know whether the
Sure.
position is flexible for that or not.
That's
Um,
amazing.
yeah, so we're
And,
still in assessment mode.
and I know many of these questions are highly dependent. I think you make a good point. Positions obviously do matter, and there's a lot to take into account based on how
Yeah,
long people have been there. I think just because this is really interesting to me, I do have one last follow-up question.
sure.
Has there been discussions on how, um, like whether or not you allow people to enter into this hybrid environment right when they start, or is there kind of a probationary period that they have to pass
Yeah.
through? I'd be
Yeah.
interested just to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. We've been talking about that as we think about evolving and publishing new guidelines, our 2.0 version, if you will. And what we've learned is that we do want the experience for the employee to be as consistent as possible. We may not hold it to a probationary period per se, but we want to work with we do want to let the employees know right up front if there's flexibility in the position. One, we
Okay.
found that we've lost great colleagues who would have otherwise considered BU. And so as soon as we learned that, we changed it, and it was wonderful to have the support to think about evolving those conversations. So they do know very early on. What we want to do is structure the onboarding process and program that we currently have in place for our employees to understand the institution so that being 3 days in the office, if they're eligible to do that, doesn't hurt them in the long term from gaining speed in learning about BU. And as long
Mm-hmm.
as it's not impacting their experience to learn that, we share with the hiring managers, please feel free to let them know when they can begin their hybrid schedule, and they submit an application and it's formalized, and we have the data and the documentation because we know that these things change, and we want to treat it as we do any other benefit, which I think has been a helpful tenet that we started with, was make sure it's treated first as a benefit for our employees, and
Sure.
secondly, as a benefit, we put in a process right away that allowed our employees to request it, change it as needed, and then there's transparency, both for the supervisor, their peers, and for the employee themselves. So we hope to
Perfect.
continue doing it in that way.
Thank you, and thanks for fielding the many follow-up questions there, Amanda.
No
That was
worries.
really helpful. Um, well, with that in mind, I'd be curious, kind of, you've already began to touch on this and provided some good examples, but what has this shift done for culture more generally, perhaps? And,
Yeah,
uh, you know, obviously acknowledging that this is a new process that nearly everyone is learning from, so nothing is going to be perfect at this point
right.
in time. But what have you seen, maybe as some of the key positives, and if there are any negatives that have come out of it, or just
Yeah.
I guess after action kind of reviews that you would note at the top of your
Yeah.
list.
Yeah, I love that. I love how you couch that, Colby, in terms of action, after action reviews. I mean, I think that that's what we all have to continue to do because
Mhm.
it just we learn and learn and learn, and we're evolving. And I think that's the one thing that I've certainly taken stock to understand is that just when we think we may have it right, we learn about another situation or another set of situations that create key considerations and that we should be thinking about. The few that I'll share with you now have been consistent so far from my observations. And the first is that while flexibility has certainly provided, I think, probably the most reliable form of mental health relief for some of our staff, I'm
Sure.
also very mindful that for those employees who are not eligible for it, if they're not being offered any other type of flexibility, they're quickly just going to continue to burn out.
Right.
And so what's imperative and what I lose sleep over some days is what are we going to do for those staff members and those colleagues?
Hmm.
And so that has become a clear lesson learned is we must find some flexible ways to offer our staff who aren't eligible for remote or hybrid work to also have some flexibility in their work, to keep them engaged, to keep them productive, to keep their mental health as a priority. So that's clearly one lesson. I think the other lesson is in a hybrid work environment, I think there was just an assumption for a long time that as we moved more into the endemic and moved more into stabilizing this benefit, remote work in terms of Zoom meetings that are coupled now with in person meetings, I think there was just this assumption that our days wouldn't get longer, but that our
Sure.
days would kind of stabilize a little more to the schedule. And what I've certainly learned is that hasn't been the case. I hear often And this is a lesson learned that I'm sharing here. Is just a pain point right now that I'm so interested in learning how to solve for. Is when our employees are remotely working, their days are jam packed from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting. They don't allow themselves to take breaks. They don't allow themselves to take a lunch, as if they would if they were mimicking the office experience. And that's
Hmm.
something I think is imperative upon us for those employees while they're working in a hybrid environment, is to continue to inform them of our expectations to take care of themselves and to make
Yeah,
sure they're taking breaks. Make sure we started several strategies that I'm happy to share in this moment with you, Colby, that our team started. But and I shared it with our managers last year after we saw that it was working for our team. But we end the meetings 10 to 15 minutes early to give our employees a break, and we're like, don't do anything. That's your time to protect, either following up to the meeting just as you would in office in person
sure.
environment, ending those meetings early, taking the breaks, blocking it out on your calendar so other colleagues are aware that you're not available. And what I mean here is it would be treated as any other meeting would. So when you have to
Right.
schedule a meeting, whether it's hybrid or in person, right? Um, when you have to schedule that meeting, there's a commitment there. And we have to be mindful and respectful of that commitment. If it's a super urgent topic, then we say, you seem busy at this time. Is there maybe some other day or time that we can do this today because it's urgent? And we wanted to be
Hmm.
really transparent about offering that guidance, because those types of transparent expectations, I think, are what's going to help our employees in a hybrid environment get that mental relief that they so desperately also need, which was a real learning lesson for me in particular, as I found that while everyone enjoyed the promise and the intentionality behind remote work, it served over the long term, over these past few years, it has served to also create bottlenecks and
Hmm.
blocks, right? Because we have meeting on top of meeting to try to mimic
Sure.
walking down the office to see our colleagues. And so we have to think about different ways using the chat feature and other ways of connecting very quickly, very instantly. Our Teams channel, I wasn't using Teams very often before I got to BU. My colleagues were. And I learned very quickly how invaluable it is. And you can see chats right away and get decisions made, and it's mimicking the down the hall office conversations.
Yeah.
So I think those are just a couple of lessons that I certainly have learned that have been consistent and for which we must solve for in order to make sure our mental health of our colleagues remain a priority in this new world of work.
I love this, and I'm really, really glad that you talked about it and brought it up. I think it's a really interesting point of emphasis because we often see the other narrative being tossed out, and that is that people are using their remote time, or the ability to take that remote work and taking advantage of it, and perhaps not doing anything during the day, or that's the worry of their employers, is that they're at home, they surely are not working, when in fact in a lot of settings, people are working even harder, and those kind of built-in breaks are not occurring. So it's nice to see, or I guess nice to hear
Yeah.
that actually there is a different, there is a different possibility coming out of this. So I guess the follow-up question I'd have, Amanda, is taking those two considerations into mind, where we have, maybe some people taking advantage of the system and some people really, I don't know, overcompensating
Yes.
for having that ability to work remotely.
Yes.
Um,
Right.
how do we arrive in the middle there, other than the ways that already provided? I think that's a great idea to build in kind of those breaks after the
Yeah.
meetings. I know if I'm on a conversation for an hour and a half, I would hope in an office setting I'd have 10 minutes. So it makes sense that I should have 10 minutes at home, but we
That's right.
often don't consider that. So any other suggestions or anything that comes to mind
Oh.
that would help us kind of fall in the middle?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for asking, Colby, because I do think that something we are really paying attention to here at BU is another dynamic around talent development. We've been talking about the new ways of the new leader for a while now, and
Hmm.
not as it relates to remote work and hybrid work, as you know, but just as it relates to skill building and making our staff feel engaged and more welcome and that they belong from a DEI perspective, for example, DEIB perspective. And so we've been talking about this new leader style and the new way of thinking as a leader. I think remote and hybrid work adds a dimension to that catalog, if you will, of learning
Sure.
as a new leader. And what I mean here is the emergence of the leader who trusts and who finds different ways to engage their employees versus, as I mentioned at the top of our meeting, of our interview today, versus walking around and seeing. There has to be a way to engage the trust in conversation that doesn't require constant Zoom meetings, constant channels, and emails. We've got to allow ourselves as supervisors and leaders of others to show our care in different ways and to show that we're interested in getting the work done in different ways. And specifically, that means setting deadlines, not letting the employees under our supervision feel that we need to monitor them throughout the way to that deadline, but having periodic, meaningful check-ins and really committing to those. I have some colleagues who sometimes get so overwhelmed, they are repeatedly canceling their weekly meetings with their staff, and they share it with me. They're so concerned that they have to cancel those. And my guidance back to them as they talk to me as a colleague, I've shared with them, don't force yourself not to. Keep those periodic anchored times with your supervisor colleagues, peers, or your staff. Keep those times. It anchors us to have those conversations. It anchors us to then talk about the outcomes, the things that we are trusting our staff to have been getting done along the way. And then being really honest and candid about our expectations when we don't see things being met. There have been some employees, along the way on my team, across BU and other higher ed institutions, where we have identified that hybrid work isn't working for them. They feel very lonely, they don't feel as productive, they don't have the same interaction that they thrive from when they're in the office. And we've said, let's reduce your hybrid work. I know you really want it, let's reduce it, or in fact, let's eliminate it for a period of time. And let's see how that works. So it doesn't have to be meant as a takeaway, right? It's like any other benefit. If it's not working for you, then we want to modify it and evolve it to work for you and to work for BU, right, as your employer. So I think allowing leaders to emerge as trusting their employees, focusing on engagement, focusing on those expectations of time management, and not just seeing our staff as producers of work, I think is a very, very key tenet that we're going to see evolve as part of the emergence of the new leader today.
That's amazing. I love this as well. I think, like trust is everything. And, kind of circling back to the top of the call, we had a discussion about how it's often rare in kind of the course of our lives, or at least in our work schedule, where we get the opportunity to talk about something personal. And I think, your emphasis on keeping kind of these one-on-one meetings is a great example of whether that's, happening remotely or happening in person. These are key meetings to reinforce a number of things. And I saw a good anecdote the other day where there was someone talking about how the difference in one-on-one meetings between particular managers from the other side of the table. You were talking about some of the supervisors from the employee side of the table. Many one-on-one conversations in the past had been show up, talk about what I've been doing, did I complete it, and that was the extent of the conversation. Whereas some one-on-one conversations, just taking a couple minutes to kind of have that personal connection about their life as well as the work they're accomplishing, and kind of trusting that they'll bring up the things that need to be addressed in that conversation, really, kind of monumentally shifted this organization on how they approach those conversations. So I'm glad to hear you're reinforcing that. And obviously, I think none of this conversation is possible without the trust, across an organization. So.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it speaks to the heart of being what we know we hear so much about today, to your point, Colby, which is being an authentic leader. Illustrating that trust, right, also leads to I care about you, and because I care about you, I trust you. I trust you to do well. And I have found, through very, very great mentors and leaders in my own journey, in my own career journey, that those pivotal relationships with leaders have been everything for me to learn more and to be trusted to learn more. And when I, maybe missed a goal or didn't meet my own expectations, I beat myself up 3 times more than my
Right.
supervisor ever would have.
Right.
And I
Right.
remember having a supervisor say that to me. He said, I never worry if you don't meet a goal. I'm sad for you because I know you're going to go home and beat yourself up so much more than I could have ever said. And I was like, so true. I hate not to have done what I needed to do. So I do think from that perspective, performance management and
Hmm.
metrics and outcomes don't go away. They don't all of a sudden become invisible because we're working at an alternate location, right?
Right. Right.
We hold ourselves to it, but to your point, we're infusing the trust, creating the engagement. And, I'd offer that those employees who are not eligible for remote work ought to be managed the same way while they're
Yeah.
on campus, right? Keeping those same one-on-ones, periodic anchors to communicate, and having leadership reflect the authenticity that I think our employees need so desperately today. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Well, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm a big prescriber of authentic leadership. I think it's really important to meet people where they're at. So whether that 30 minutes is them just having the opportunity to vent about the things in their personal life, or 30 minutes to ask questions about what they may need help with, really just creating that space is half the battle. And we're having a conversation today through this medium, so it's entirely possible to do it remote.
Yeah.
It's just acknowledging what works best for that person, not discrediting some of those in-person interactions that need to occur. But yeah, I'm so glad we got to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you, Colby. Me too.
Yeah, and then so I guess just a couple more questions, Amanda. I guess
Sure.
I'm really interested in knowing maybe any other unexpected trends or patterns that arose. I know we've kind of already touched on a few of these, but if there's anything else this year, like, oh, this was also very surprising, I think everybody would love to hear that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Colby. I'll share one final thought on this that's come up probably a little bit more recently, if you will. But I think it's really important to just put it out there for us to talk about and solve for, and be aware of, if you will, more than solve for, but be aware of. And I think that's, for higher ed in particular, what we have identified is some institutions have gone back in person 100%. Some have maintained a hybrid environment like us, and some have said it's okay, continue what you're doing, right? Whether it's hybrid, whether it's in person, no policies need to be in place. One of the things that I've come to learn is that so many of us are driven to serve the academic mission for our students. And that lends itself to understanding who our students' profiles are, who
Hmm.
gets attracted to be enrolled at our institutions. Why do they want to come here? What's their value proposition personally? And what I've come to learn is that hybrid, remote, flexible work options for staff in particular, while many of our staff have not really seen themselves as part of being directly tied to the mission, I think that happens a lot in higher ed institutions where my colleagues who work under my leadership in HR sometimes often don't see themselves as directly impacting the mission for our students, but we do. And I think
Hmm.
we've always seen staff at higher ed institutions as the producers, if you will.
Sure.
All
Yeah.
right, and our faculty being directly tied to the mission, and our faculty have always been saying to us, no, we absolutely need the staff as
Yes.
well.
Yes.
And I think to that point, uniquely, I think our faculty members are saying that we need you to be here with us when we have to be here as well. And I
Hmm.
think sometimes that mixed message for our staff has been, wait a minute, I'm being told I could have flexible work and to think about flexible work and hybrid work, but then on the other end, I have my faculty supervisor or my chair or our members in academic departments in our libraries, for example, who need us here. What am I supposed to do? And that was something that I don't think I had really thought too much in precision about ahead of time. And what I've come to learn is that we have, again, being flexible means being flexible not just for yourself as a staff member, as an employee, but being flexible to what our institutions need. Some of our institutions are serving many, many students in communities where that student in-person experience means everybody needs to be there for them to feel like they belong, for them to feel like their needs are being served. And I think for us to take a step back and understand that, it may mean that some of our staff members are working remotely for 2 days a week and in the office 3 days a week for maybe 3 months at a time or 6 months at
Sure.
a time but not a full 12 months at a time, right? And that
Yeah.
was something I hadn't really contemplated. So look out for that in our 2.0 guidelines, because that is feedback we learned along the way. And I think it's imperative that we all take that consideration and think about it in a much more global way, if you will. What are the needs of the student, both within the institution from our value proposition, but from our community, students who we want to attract locally,
Hmm.
regionally, nationally, and even globally? Because that takes an understanding on all four of those levels to make sure that our students, when they're here, understand that that experience for them is why they're here and keeps them here. And then the other part of that student experience is making sure that they feel like they belong from a DEIB perspective. And that was something I hadn't really learned.
Yeah, I love that. I think we could probably have an entire webinar about that topic alone. And
No question.
just the impact and just the energy probably felt on campus, while the students are there versus not. I'm sure you'll have a ton of lessons learned coming out of
Oh,
even,
yeah.
just instituting these policies.
Absolutely, Colby. And I see a few questions that have come in just about that. And I think, in terms to your point of, frequently revisiting our policies, I actually think seeing a future where hybrid policy is permanent needs to be met with, like many other policies we've had in place. We need to just remain really agile around our hiring policies, our retention policies, our benefits policies and guidelines. And I foresee hybrid policy being absolutely no different. So I just want to take a minute and address that while we could.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. That's perfect. And then, I have just one more question, Amanda, before we kind of hop into the Q&A portion of
Oh,
this
sure,
conversation.
sure.
I'm curious to know what role technology plays in this process and instituting these policies, and really, in particular, we at Criterion are very interested in knowing how HCM solutions can integrate to kind of change this work landscape as well.
Yeah, I thank you for that question. That is huge. I think that as we continue regarding regardless of whether it's hybrid, fully remote, for a long time we've been seeing a need that's becoming more and more central to operating well and in an
Hmm.
agile format for HR. We've been seeing the real relevant value of technology and that connection. So it's no longer at all just documenting and digitizing um, documents through workflows and processes. At one point in time, we all thought workflows was, oh my gosh, we can increase the cycle time. Yay, we've done it
Yeah.
with
Yes.
technology. I know I was one of those fans.
Yes.
And so I'm still one of those fans. But what I've done to expand my learning, and our leadership team members have also expanded their learning as well, is thinking about technology in very, very different ways.
Hmm.
For example, we are going to look at adding on a chat box driven by AI for our frontline service center employees so that they can manage general questions in such a way that it doesn't require them typing an answer in and literally being there on the phone to answer a general question. And I think that we have to force ourselves to find technology partners who can give us great solutions to those types of challenges that we have. What I foresee will happen is as we develop those skills more and more and embed more technology, we will be freed up to become better consultants for colleagues, individual contributors, and supervisors across our institutional communities. I think that's imperative for us to do as we go forward. And there's no way we could do it without clear and reliable technology structures. So thank you for that.
Well done, Amanda. And I know I said that was the last question, but I do have one small
Of
follow-up.
course.
Much
Sure.
like upending any processes, what's your advice on, I guess, changing the culture of an organization or getting people to maybe move away from the ways that they've become comfortable to, streamline how they do things today versus maybe how they've done things for the past 20, 25 years?
Yeah, I mean, well, Colby, the way you set up the question says it all, right? You know what you're doing, and you got it right. You hit the nail on the head. It takes a lot of time. When we
Hmm.
have change management initiatives underway, as you absolutely know, it takes time. And I know oftentimes time is not on our side to
Sure.
move large scale change management initiatives. What I know for sure, though, is that if it's rushed And if employees don't have their voice embedded in how
Hmm.
those changes occur and at what pace they can occur, to give them time to learn, adapt, normalize that change, um, it's like a house of cards. It'll just fall apart. And then it becomes one of those conversations that I know you and I hear frequently about, Colby, which is, whatever happened to that thing that we were trying 2 years ago and we launched a pilot of it and now we don't hear anything about it? That's what it'll become, right? Yesterday's news and a has-been initiative that really had great potential. And as you can imagine, with that much detail, I've been there and had those
Yes.
experiences. And so, what I've learned along the way is exactly what you said. When you have 20, 25 years of doing something a specific way, we have to allow time and creative ways of embedding the change through focus groups, getting their feedback, piloting things for a specific period of time, taking it in phases when it's a large scale initiative that has to be implemented. Those are definitely a few tenets that I've learned that have consistently allowed for change to stick in large organizations in particular, where it's even tougher to have those small community conversations very quickly. So thank you for that question. I appreciate that follow up. That was great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for humoring me on that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks.
Awesome. Well, I think this is the portion where we're going to open it up for questions. We will also, share our contact information as well following this. But um, let me open up the. So we have a few in here, so I'll go ahead and take a look. Uh, I think we've addressed this first one a little bit, Amanda, but just to reiterate, maybe it's good we talk about it again. Has really how has hybrid work changed kind of the workforce planning aspect for higher ed, and has it made it easier to retain and hire staff for you all?
Yeah, thank you. Colby, I think I agree with you. I think we addressed a lot of it, and I'll touch on, if I may, the workforce planning specifically. I think
Hmm.
from a strategic perspective, we know that, particularly in higher ed, we have once a year opportunities to think about how we can plan for the year from
Sure.
a staffing perspective. And I would offer that if we have the technology and we're aggressively pursuing those avenues, it has tremendous impact on those workforce planning conversations. Because I've, shared with our leadership team here, and they've been so interested in having these conversations more often, which I love. And that is, having fewer headcount deployed to do specific higher level work because technology enables it has
Hmm.
been, it unleashes so much creativity and innovation. And when I say fewer headcount, I don't mean just reducing the staff and saying, okay, we need 3 people instead of 5 to do this. We're actually redeploying them in
Okay.
other spaces and in new jobs. We launched a data analytics unit, for example, in our across our HR division that we otherwise would not have been able to launch had we not redeployed qualified colleagues for that work and used technology to support the work to augment from their previous roles. And that's just one small example. And so I offer that up as ways to think about planning for the workforce on an annual basis.
Love that, and I think it's so important that we continue to reiterate that in many instances technology is not put in place to eliminate anyone's job. It's put in place to make things easier and perhaps allow you to allocate your time more efficiently elsewhere.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Second question we had was really around how frequently do you or BU plan to revisit these policies? It sounds like if it's not already, we're approaching a period where this will be a permanent offering, but maybe just reiterating, kind of what it looks like on a trial basis at this point too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I touched on it on purpose earlier around, how we're looking at it. And you're right, Colby. It's going to be more permanent from our purview. But with that comes the expectation of understanding what does the long-term sustainability look like. And that was the last point I mentioned in terms of lesson learned, and I suspect that our long-term sustainability approach is going to be like other policies we look at, and it's going to be based on the anecdotal feedback and situations to operate, right? What meets the flexibility and need operationally that drives how we determine whether that flexibility is part of the year, part of a day, I suspect that we will be broader in our guidelines to iterate and as we go on, but then to also answer and speak to these unique situations that we've been learning about anecdotally over the year. And I foresee that it would be an often frequent looked at policy as we continue to evolve flexible work at BU, not unlike our benefits policies, our hiring policies, and retention policies that we've also had to look at.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for that answer. And then last question we have is really talking about community and that this is such an essential part of, not only the staff's experience, but obviously the students as well. I think we touched on this a little bit too as well, Amanda, but it's definitely great for us to revisit how are institutions really going to be able to kind of keep this sense of community in a hybrid environment? And is that something you're concerned about? My hunch is no, based on the conversation we've had, but I would love to hear, if somebody was playing devil's advocate with you, how you would respond to them.
Yeah, thank you, Colby. And what I love about being at BU is we have those advocacy type conversations often, which makes
Mm-hmm.
me feel like when we do publish something, it has been battle tested and kicked around,
Sure.
which in any great environment where there's trust and collaboration intentionally, that's what you get. You get the opportunity to be informed by what we don't already see relevant right in front of us. And so I say that to say we've had many colleagues think about these challenging questions, and one of them is how do we continue to build community? And I think this is
Sure.
another space and point in time, Colby, where technology has great value. As we said earlier, our ability to be on Zoom, our ability to use Teams chat. Zoom has been great in coming up with consistent updates, like using
Mm-hmm.
virtual whiteboards. And I think being able to carve out specific points in time when we're in the office for events, project planning, things where the in-person connection sparks different levels of energy. I think
Right.
that's where we're going to be able to carve out and start to define what the in-office experience looks like so that the when you're not in office and in person, you have even better definition around what kind of work gets done in that space. So, that's how I expect we will do it. But I know for sure that if we continue to sustain a hybrid work environment, not just for higher ed, but in all organizations, technology has got to take a much more prominent, forward facing approach along with us, right, as we plan.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's going to be the best way that we can evolve the technology to meet our needs when we're working from just about any location.
I love that. I couldn't agree more. And I have no doubt that BU will be fine on community as long as you're involved in conversations, Amanda. So thank you
Thank you.
for that.
Thank you.
Um, Outside of that, I guess, is there anything else you'd like to add or anything I didn't ask today that you would just like to reiterate maybe one more time for the folks that are listening?
Well, I think being able to offer to my colleagues the certainty of uncertainty. I think if I could couch it that way, it's just that what I've learned most impactfully is that nothing is staying static right now in terms
Mm-hmm.
of how we attract, retain talent. That includes how do we work in a hybrid remote work environment, and that uncertainty. I think being embracing that as opposed to avoiding it has allowed me certainly to become so much more innovative in conversations that I'm involved in or that I'm contributing to. And I think that's going to be the approach that gets us to the best solutions that work for our community.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you for the
Yeah.
time today. I'm going to share my screen one final time. Our contact information is displayed here. Not seeing any other questions. You all are free to depart whenever you'd like, but feel free to reach out to either of us if you have any additional questions for Amanda or myself, whether about the content we discussed today, Criterion, BU. I think we're happy to talk about all the above. And then, we hope you enjoyed the conversation, and also linked in the chat is our LinkedIn profile. So feel free to reach out to us that way if that's a more conducive means of communication as well. So,
Yeah. Colby, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been a wonderful time with you during this hour, and I look forward to having more conversations.
yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. We'll talk to you
Thank
soon.
you. All righty. Bye bye.